compassion when my soul's in need. I find compassion for friends and enemies. My own compassion is where my spirit breathes.
Live from Santa Barbara, welcome to Compassionate Connection. I am your hostess, Gigi Amor. The purpose of our show is to share with you how to connect compassionately within ourselves and with others. When we choose to learn to communicate effectively, we can transform our lives and enrich our relationships and have a more wonderful world. Now, I'm so excited tonight. We're going to have a lot of information for you. My special guest, I'm pleased to say, is Susan Allen. Thank you for being with us tonight, Susan.
I'm thrilled. Thank you, Gigi, as always.
Now, this is going to be really interesting. This is going to be focused on young adult addiction solutions. And so for those of you that are paying attention, this is going to be great. Now, Susan Allen is the founder of the Marriage Forum, and she is a nonprofit corporation that works with families to resolve addiction, health, and relationship issues worldwide. She is a certified mediator, a certified Herman Brain Dominance trainer, and life coach. Susan has offered trainings to prisoners in California's Merit program who were jailed after domestic violence and drug-related arrest. Susan has been seen on Fox News and on hundreds of television and radio shows demonstrating the results we can create when we transform the way we think, listen, speak, and act, and focus on solutions instead of on problems. Susan offers a complimentary 1-hour private telephone session so that everyone can transform their lives. Now, I'd just like to mention that so many families have a desperate struggle with young adults suffering from life-threatening drug addiction. 15 years ago, Susan Allen has developed the Heart Space system for sobriety that has allowed countless families to save their at-risk teens and young adults. So tonight, Susan will speak about the skills and tools that are components of this evolutionary system that requires Susan's training, one fully committed family member in addition to traditional addiction strategies. Susan is an advocate for alternatives to the prison system, and this program will explain how her system works and how so many families have saved their children who were addicted to drugs so that their lives were transformed to safety, health, and success. Oh, this is so exciting, Susan. Now we're going to start out. I have so many questions for Susan. I know that, Susan, could you please explain to us what some of the key components of your heart space system for sobriety are?
Thank you so much, Gigi. Fred, if you would show the Herman Brain Map, that would be really helpful because there are two key components. Thank you so much. And if you could just leave the little one up on the screen, that would be great, as you know, just for a few minutes. So if you understand that the reason that your children have these problems, thank you, Fred. If you understand that the reason that your children have these problems is because they're not able to have the level of functionality that you have. If you really understand that it's a question of brain wiring, they are either very, very emotional, and I mean emotional, I mean fear, anger, or sadness. they're not able to be as emotionally stable as you are. Or if you understand they're not able to be organized and plan and be self-sufficient in a self-starting kind of way, whether it's in a job or in school or going all the way back, maybe to the time they were 12 or 13. When you start to understand this, then you realize that that's where the solution lies. So there are two key components that I've developed when I work with parents, which is A, to really understand the difference between themselves and their child. And sometimes tragically your child inherits this from a grandparent, a great-grandparent, from relatives you may not even know. And your child is just very different from you. Or as you'll hear later in the show, maybe you have an adopted child who doesn't have your genetic makeup, but of course you love this child and you're committed to the child. So understand the facts, understanding the skills that your child does and doesn't have, that this young adult does and doesn't have, so that you can begin to motivate and inspire him or her to learn them. Now the second thing is the 6-part chart. So if you would put that up for us, Fred, again, just for a few minutes, that would be great. Thank you. Now the 6-part chart is going to teach you how to communicate so that you motivate and inspire the young adult instead of being seen as someone who pushes or threatens or does any kind of judging or demanding. Because we find that the only way that you're going to be able to motivate and inspire someone into detox, then to stay for rehab, then to stay the whole 28 or 30 days, then to go into sober living and stay there for up to 1 year, you're going to have to be able to really motivate them. You're going to have to be seen as a loving parent, not as the enemy, right? So these are two of the many, many skills that I've offered and continue to offer, in addition to some others. But these are the two basics.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. Information is great. Now, would you please explain to us, can you identify family problems in advance of addiction where there are behaviors that you call a recipe for disaster?
Yes, it's sad and yet almost uplifting that the same patterns were repeated again and again and again. So if one parent is harsh and the other one is passive, so one is judging the child and the other one is fairly silent or even afraid to step in. If one is highly critical and demanding and the other one again is fairly silent and afraid to step in, that is a dynamic that is a recipe for disaster. And another one that is part of this whole dynamic that you need to identify, and if you find it in your own home, I teach you how to transform it, is if you're busy. So at least one parent needs to have the time and the energy and the resources to be able to identify when one of your children has a problem like this, and also be able to learn the skills that I teach and work with me enough so that he or she can motivate and inspire that young adult to safety. So it's a time-constrained problem that's the second recipe for disaster.
Thank you. How encouraging. Now, what can the parents do to avoid this problem quickly?
Well, if you see that, a lot of the work I do is prevention. That's where, of course, I'm thrilled to do prevention. Who wouldn't be? But then I get phone calls from people who are, my daughter, they say, is shooting heroin at her boyfriend's apartment, and I don't know what to do. Or, my daughter is, it's winter, but my daughter is living out on the porch at somebody's house in a sleeping bag and a tent, and that's because she's shooting heroin and we threw her out of the house. So these are the kinds of situations that I deal with. The very, very drastic solutions are required because you have a drastic situation. So in that kind of situation, you've got to immediately return your young adult child to trusting you, which of course, easier said than done. Once you get them to trust you by discontinuing the judgmental communication, discontinuing threats, discontinuing punitive behaviors. Then that's the first step to your young adult being willing to trust and listen to you. There's no way that he or she is going to trust and listen to you if you're seen as part of the problem. So that's the beginning. I'm not saying you have to be like that forever, but in the very beginning, you have to really turn the tables and transform your entire style of thinking about him or her and speaking to him or her, and even your body language. If you're saying sweet things, but it looks like you're doing this, it's not going to work.
Very clear. I understand that. That's huge. Thank you, Susan. Well, I'm curious, where does the prison system fit in your heart space system?
Well, when I taught at the Merit Program, and my friend James Beard is the one who does the teaching at the Castaic Jail, and the Merit Program has the lowest recidivism rate in the country, a very, very low rate, and their training program is the most successful in prisons, and they train other people as well, but I taught in the Castaic Program, and these men and young men who are in jail waiting sentencing are given training 5 days a week, every week for the entire time they're there. So if, heaven forbid, your child is arrested, or if you didn't know what to do and you had your child arrested and your child is in jail, please see what you can do to get your boy, young man, into the Merit Program. There isn't one at the moment, or there wasn't the last time I checked, one for young women. But at least there is this, and it is a remarkable program. So look it up online, check into it, and see about that. However, the training that I give parents eliminates the entire need for this desperate strategy. If you can research detox and rehab that is either paid for by some nonprofit or that is paid for by some church, and you learn from me, or if your insurance covers this, or if you are wealthy enough to pay for rehab and sober living, of course you want to prevent your child from going into jail or prison because of the terrible things that can happen there. And I hope you don't need me to tell you about that.
That's a great place to avoid. Thank you for helpful advice. Now, what has changed since the 1970s war on drugs, and how does this impact patients today?
Well, I remember when Nixon came into power and the war on drugs in the early 70s began to be such a powerful thing, and it was a lot of drama and a lot of police activity and a lot of jail and a lot of prisons. And what happened is all the funding for mental health facilities started to dry up. And all of the things that you parents are dealing with now are the result of the war on drugs, which decided that people should not be treated as if they were ill. They should be treated as if they were criminals. And this is, of course, the tragedy, and this is the pendulum that you at Families Act and all the other organizations around the world like this are working so hard to counterbalance. Because you've got to get to a place where the government supports the understanding that mental illness is, in so many cases, the reason for this drug addiction and for the drug addiction explosion that's going on right now.
Thank you, Susan. And could you explain to us what is happening in Staten Island, New York, that is a huge breakthrough for addiction?
Yes, and I actually want to read this to you because I don't want to miss anything. So if you know where Staten Island is, it's one of the 5 boroughs of New York City, and they have an addiction rate that is 3 times higher than in other parts of New York City. And I just saw this on CNN. I'm sure that if you're seeing this show at about the time that we actually did this tonight live, you can probably still find this on the CNN website. Every 5 days on Staten Island, someone dies of a heroin overdose. And I've been to Staten Island, I'm from New York. It's a very small island. The Staten Island ferry that, you can see the Statue of Liberty, that's what we're talking about. And it's a very small island, and it's a blue-collar place. Almost everybody who lives there is blue-collar. Many firemen live there. Many police officers live there. So, we're talking about a kind of a tough love environment. We're not talking about warm, fuzzy, oh, my son is ill, my daughter's ill. We're talking about people who are, many of them, their job is to uphold the laws in New York State. So because of the desperation of their heroin overdose rate of being so high, the Staten Island Police Department has been giving naloxone to these young people and children and people of any age who are on the verge of overdosing. They were giving it in injections. They were originally trained to give it in injections. Now they have a nasal spray. So naloxone is an incredible drug that brings somebody back from the brink of an overdose. And according to the piece that I heard, and I would really encourage you to learn about it, if you have a relative, if you have a loved one who is taking opioids or heroin, naloxone is what you want to keep. You want to have it. You want to give it to them. You want to make sure that you save the life of your beloved child.
That's encouraging. Thank you. That's great information. Now, I know that it's said that here in Santa Barbara and, of course, elsewhere in the United States, addicts are caught in the revolving door. And could you explain to us how to solve this issue?
Well, the concept of revolving door. If you have a very small child and you're going into an actual literal revolving door at a department store, let's say, you're not going to let your child go in alone, right? You would never think of it. You would have your child very close to you. You would hold on to the child. You would get the child into the revolving door. You would get them out into the department store. The fact that this is an expression that I hear tells me that parents aren't understanding the power that you potentially have to make the difference. And that's why I developed the Heartspace system for sobriety. When a parent tells me, this is what's happening, it's hopeless, there's nothing we can do, I know that that's not true, because I've helped so many parents just like you who had an adult child or even a child in their 40s. It doesn't have to be just someone who's 20 and therefore have no legal rights over getting them to the right doctor and reading the doctor's report and all that. You could have the same problem, heaven forbid, when your child is 40. So I've worked with parents of all different ages, and I've also worked with spouses who have this problem as well. And you've got to understand that there's a role for you. If you choose, that you can become educated, you can make the difference, and we'll tell you about some of these situations later. And my website is up here, and I think my YouTube channel is up here as well, and you can look at a lot of these YouTube shows that I've done.
Thank you, Susan. Now I'd like to go into what does a dual diagnosis mean, and how common is this problem with addicts?
Yeah, thank you. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm only quoting what doctors I've worked with have said, that it's now clear that every single addict has a dual diagnosis. And my experience is, when I've worked in these families, happy children, happy young adults, happy adults are not taking drugs in this quantity. They're simply not. Happy people are not sitting home and shooting up. Happy people are not sitting home drinking a bottle of vodka or 2 bottles of wine or even 1 bottle of wine. Happy people are not gambling away the mortgage money. Happy people are not following home people for predatory sex 3 or 4 times a day. These are addictive behaviors that are indicative of someone who is in excruciating pain. And based on what I've seen in every single case, there's a brain chemistry imbalance and a brain wiring imbalance. And I work on the brain wiring imbalance and teach you how to do that. And there are fabulous doctors who can work on the brain chemistry imbalance.
How wonderful. There's just so much hope and resolution.
But it's not easy.
Oh, yes.
The
they have
thing
to
is,
do their work.
tonight is all about the hope for you if you've never heard about this before. And I'm the first one to tell you, this is not easy. This is time intensive. You have to work with me, so there's, money involved. It's not easy, but at least it exists. The solution is there.
I love that. And the results, a brand new happy life.
Yes.
Now, what do you mean when you refer to the underlying addictions?
Thank you. It's been my experience that every single person who has what they call an addictive personality, you've heard this? Well, the addictive personality is someone who, again, through brain chemistry, drifts into fear, anger, and sadness. They drift into fear, anger, and sadness. They get stuck on this emotional roller coaster. They don't know how to get off the emotional roller coaster. They can't function in a way that would allow them to get the results they want. And then they feel hopeless and despairing. And this happens with people who are addicts, and this happens with people who are not addicts. So it's not a question of only people who have addiction problems live on this roller coaster. A lot of people who are rather highly functional by comparison have it, but if they didn't suffer from this brain chemistry issue of not enough serotonin, not enough dopamine, not enough endorphins, imagine how effective they would really be. So that's the trick.
Thank you. Now, I know, Susan, that you worked with two siblings as children, a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, where you did identify what you call the underlying addiction that pre-exists before every drug and alcohol problem. So how did you go about resolving this problem?
So to take the idea of when can you really identify this. So let's say you already have a young adult who has a major problem with addiction, and that's why you're watching the show. But I'm speaking to you if you also have a younger child, and I'm speaking to all of you who may be watching the show not for a specific problem or a specific young adult at home, but you have a child who's going to fit into this model. And that's why I want to always do anything I can to work on prevention as much as resolution. So I was working with a young girl who was 7 because her father heard about me, and she was crying every day about something. So every day she was crying about something. And it turned out when she did have the test, it turned out she had an imbalance of serotonin and dopamine. She was feeling this way, very triggered and very sad because she needed to take supplements, even a little girl like that. When she learned from me how to calm herself down, when her parents learned from me and the expert that I sent them to about this test that she could take at home and about these supplements, we had such a remarkable outcome. Now, I would work with her maybe twice a year because I taught her how to calm herself down. I taught her how to speak to her mom and her dad. She was very sensitive, which is another key thing. We see in a lot of cases that the person becomes an addict is highly sensitive. Sensitive to anger in the household, sensitive to any kind of violence in school, sensitive to any kind of pressure. And this is someone with an adrenal issue. So that's another one of the tests that's available to find out, does this person, even a 7-year-old, have some sort of an adrenal issue? Do they need adrenal support? So in this case, all of this is being taken care of. But now she's got a brother who kicks her, which is certainly the last thing that she needs, right? So she has a brother who kicks her. So I speak to the parents, and at the time they didn't seem interested in really doing anything about it. As much as I could motivate them, you know how that is. You do what you can to motivate people. Sometimes it's enough, sometimes it's not. I'm no different from you. We're not doing, miracles, we're not forcing people. But now the little boy at 4 had a problem at school. So he got some notes from the teacher that really alarmed his mother. His mother is a very busy woman and doesn't have time. I told you that's a trigger, right? And the father is very, very busy. He doesn't have much time either. So that's a problem there. We've also got one parent who's very harsh and one parent who's very passive. So another real trigger. I spoke to the little boy at 4. I spoke to him a few times for 15 minutes each, because the younger you are, the faster you get what I teach. I spoke to each of his parents for a couple of sessions, so that's a couple of 1-hour sessions, and I spoke to the parents a couple of times together, and the problem disappeared. It's now been a very long time. This little boy doesn't have any problem in school. He doesn't have any problem at home. So we have eliminated the old behaviors that he had, which were causing him to not fit in at school and have problems at home, which of course would have been a potential cascade of events leading to addiction. And we just turned the whole thing around when he was very, very young.
That is just awesome. Thank you. That is great. So, how can parents actually help transform the children's that have suicidal thoughts?
Yes, if you have a young adult who's been an addict for a while, then you certainly know, you don't need me to tell you, that this is a suicidal behavior. Now, there are degrees, right? I was just speaking with someone a few days ago. So whether someone is slashing their wrists or slashing their arm makes a world of difference. If somebody's slashing their wrist, they are in imminent danger of death right away. If someone is slashing their arm, they're not. However, we have to understand that this entire conversation is about children who are at grave risk, and that's obvious. The common denominator of all the suicidal people I've ever worked with, and I've worked with about 5 of them at this point, not many, but I don't seek it, and that's certainly not, certainly not what you would expect because I'm not a psychiatrist. But in each and every case, when I've worked with someone who's suicidal, number 1, they're all still alive today. Number 2, they felt hopeless that their needs to feel happy and loved could ever be met. And that is the difference that you, the parent, can make. Giving them unconditional love instead of harsh judgments is not really a choice you can make. You must provide unconditional love because they don't know how to give it to themselves. So when they work with me, yes, I can give it to them. I can give them that sense of self. I can give them that sense of being valuable and precious. But I can't live with them. I can't give it to them 7 days a week. And if they're going to go into detox and rehab, you're the one who can give them this love, even when you're not allowed to speak to them. You can send them this love. And when you're allowed to visit them, you can reinforce it. You can commit yourself to that because that's the common denominator that every single addict and every single suicidal person desperately needs.
I love that word and I love that energy.
Yes,
Thank you.
You are that energy.
That's so important.
Yes.
Now, there is an at-home test that accurately diagnoses if your child, anytime after 2 years of age, is likely to need special support to avoid addiction. Please share with us what that's about.
Yes, it's really amazing. There's a test, depending on their age. So there's a test which is a little bit more complicated that is saliva plus urine. And you can find out about their adrenal function as well as the neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters are the things that make people feel happy and make people feel uplifted and energized about life, open to life. But if you have a young adult who's an addict, you're not going to be able to track them every 4 hours and make sure they do this, and it's too complicated. So Mary at Ovitamin Pro, and that's ovitaminpro.com, and Mary Schlenger is the owner. She's developed a system for very young people and also for addicts where you can't track them, where it's just a simple urine test at home. You have to be very clear that you're not testing them for drugs, which you're not. You're not testing them for drugs, and they need to know that because they're not going to want to take the test if they think you're testing them for drugs, right? So it's very important. Ovitamin Pro, Mary Schlenger, speak to her on the phone or set up an email time and speak about it, and you'll find out exactly what's going on and it will make sense. And then they can take supplements.
That's very good. That's wonderful. And that trust, I like that. It's not for testing for anything
Not
other.
at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Now, what are the key signposts of addiction in young adults long before there is a diagnosis of bipolar disease or another diagnosis, and how is this linked to the brain map?
Well, the first thing you always notice is that a child is not doing well either socially or in school or both. So Fred, if you put that little Herrmann brain dominance map up, if you can, thank you. And so if you take a look, every single addict has two things in common. The lower right brain, the red quadrant, which is where emotions live. And this is based on the Sperry brain map, so it is authentically a biological map which has been simplified. But lower right means lower right, and upper right means upper right, and it's according to your head, right? So they have too much emotion, lower right brain, and by that I mean too much negative emotion. They're not too happy, they're too sad, or too angry, or too scared, or too frightened, angry, and sad. And they also, in every single case that I've discovered, they don't have enough lower left brain, which is where the action exists and the safety thoughts and planning and organizing. And it makes sense, that every rehab in the world has the people in it making their beds and sweeping the floor and doing the dishes and helping the kitchen. And this is based on the fact that they have to develop the part of their brain where they do things. Simple, small tasks that they do where they get a sense of participating with other people and a sense of satisfaction. But it isn't really about that. It's not about the sweeping, and it's not about the beds, and it's not about the showers. It's not about the breakfast, even though you may think it is. It's about changing their brain. You need them to have a different brain, and that's what it does.
Oh, that's great. Now, I know that you also teach the parents empathy, key word, and in your videos you demonstrate the process of empathy. Why is this so crucial to training a young adult from drugs to safety and success?
Well, in the most extraordinary of all the families that I worked with, which is on my YouTube channel, is a man whose son was a homeless drug addict for 6 years. And they had given up, as any parent would in that situation, given up the thought that they could ever bring their son home, that their son could ever have a successful life, that their son could ever do anything besides be a homeless drug addict on crystal meth living on the streets of San Francisco. And you'll see the show, and you'll see the young man, you'll see the dad, and I've done a number of shows with the dad and one with the son. And what's so remarkable is that all that the dad learned to do in the early days was give his son empathy by changing the way he was thinking about his son. Within 10 days of beginning to work with me, his son called home for the first time in 10 months. And that was the first miracle. Then the dad raced up to San Francisco to meet his son, and his son was actually there. His son didn't play a game with him, his son was really there. And they spent a wonderful weekend together. And this was repeated the next week. And the next week, the dad ran up there and was with his son. And it was amazing because that time he was able to get his son to really shower and clean up and come back to Santa Barbara. So that's how fast it happened. It took a little bit longer to motivate his son into detox, but he accomplished that, and his son has been clean and sober for about 7 years now. Finished school, doing things that he loves. It's a completely different life.
I know these people, and what a wonderful experience it is now. Now, I know that you've said many times that a happy person doesn't take drugs, so that drugs and alcohol beyond a very small amount of marijuana and beer are actually symptoms. So could you explain what that means to us?
Yes, I mean, we find that when a young person is using a lot of drugs and using a lot of alcohol, in every case, if they feel safe to tell you, they're going to tell you that they really feel unhappy, or they feel confused, or they feel lost, or they feel angry, or they feel frustrated. And you'll see this every time. And it's only when they feel safe to tell you. So that's why thinking empathetically and communicating empathetically is so crucial, because you've got to be able to get that young adult's trust and keep the trust.
That's a huge factor. I'm glad you keep mentioning that. Now, why is empathic one-on-one attention for the parent to the young adult suffering with addiction so important?
If you are thinking that you can just kind of leave them on their own and it's all going to work out, that's not true. And so you can't ask them what's wrong, because they won't tell you, and maybe they don't even know. So you have to learn empathy. Gosh, I imagine you had a tough day at school, if they're in college, let's say. A tough day in school because this is a subject that's really difficult for you. Now, years later, if the child is now using, the child is having a lot of trouble, can barely get back home, then it's a different empathy, of course. Gosh, honey, I imagine you'd like to just go to sleep. You really probably just need some rest. Instead of having that thought that, oh, he was out all night and he's loaded, and you can't do any of that. You have to just really be here, present with your child who's in pain and is lost. And caring and loving, and, can I get you something? Presumably they don't have much appetite, but I'd love to make your favorite dish for you. Something loving and caring, that's empathy. So that you're not the enemy and you don't see them as the enemy. And that is a 180-degree shift for most of you, isn't it? Because you haven't heard this. But I have to tell you that parents who've known this instinctively have been able to save their children without me. Because I've got two very good friends who saved their daughters from addiction years and years ago, long before they ever met me, and long before there were all these programs available, because they just said, my daughter's going to, survive, and I'm just going to work with her, and I'm going to love her, and she's going to make it. And these are very good friends of mine, and in both cases, the girls are fine. They're not girls anymore. They're in their 40s.
That's fabulous. They're really there, present with them, without that pointing fingers. Now, please give us an example of a young adult suffering from heroin addiction whose parents studied with you and had great results of their daughter becoming clean and staying clean.
She had had problems in school. She'd had learning disabilities in school. This had expanded into social problems. She finally had a boyfriend, but tragically, he had his own problems and he was a heroin addict. And they didn't realize that. And when they called me, she was already shooting up with her boyfriend. And so they had banned her from the house because they didn't know what to do, and they had listened to tough love people, which of course is not anything that I understand. And so I had to explain to them, if they continued on this road, then how are they ever going to get her clean? How are they ever going to get her to trust them? How are they ever going to motivate her into detox? And what we were able to do is we certainly understood that they didn't want to leave her home alone, which I would never advocate either. So they had a combination now where they let her sleep at her boyfriend's because his parents were there and his mother didn't have a career. So the mother was home making sure they were alive and they weren't going to overdose. And that was like having an unpaid nurse's aide was very helpful. And then my clients, the husband and the wife, who were the parents of the girl, they were beginning to have a new kind of relationship with their young adult daughter, who was 19 at the time, and take her out for lunch, meet her for dinner, take her here, take her there, really recreating the parental relationship, allowing her to feel that she was part of the family again, even if she wasn't living there, really making sure that she felt that there was this family who loved her, which she did not feel when she was left at her boyfriend's. And little by little, I trained the mom and the dad to communicate with her in an empathetic way and research different detox and rehabs that they could afford and do all the research they could on these places to make sure that they were legitimate and they were acceptable. And then they worked with their daughter, and I never even spoke to the daughter. I just worked with the parents. And one day she said, I'm ready. And they made the call. There was a bed available. And they got her in the car and they took her down to, a little, where was it? It was not far from Newport, if I recall. And they found a place, and she was amazingly accepted by her roommates. It was the social group that she'd never had. Tragically, they all had, heroin in common, but these were peers for her. They had gone through the same kind of problems she had gone through, and this is what had happened. And then she went from there into sober living. She got her job. She had a new life. And what was most interesting is that little by little, she terminated the relationship with the boyfriend who had been the bad influence all along. Because as she developed more self-respect, as she got more respect from others and from her parents, she no longer wanted anything much to do with him.
Oh, that's a wonderful happy ending again. Now, what was the most difficult part of this for the parents?
Continuing to stay empathetic in spite of the fact that it took time. It took months. It didn't take weeks, it took months. So even with the young man who had been a homeless drug addict, it only took 10 days for him to make contact with his dad. It took 11 days then for his dad to see him, 10 days plus 1 to drive up there. But even though he got him back to Santa Barbara in another 10 days, it still took about 2 months or so to motivate and inspire his son to go into detox and rehab. But he kept at it and he never quit. And that's the thing. So if you're the parent and you have a child who lives on an emotional roller coaster, lower right brain, and you don't have a lot of consistent action skills, lower left brain, and your child has inherited this from you, then you've got to evolve in order to provide what your child needs. And that's difficult. But boy, evolution happens quickly in a crisis. The more the crisis is, the bigger the crisis, the faster each of us have to evolve, because otherwise we don't make it. There's no guarantee that any of us is going to make it. So I'm here to say, this is what works. I've tested this again and again and again. I can, when we talk on the phone, if you call for a free session, I'll give you all the different scenarios. I'll tell you what I see in your particular case and what I would recommend. And that's how we get everybody home safe. Clean, sober, and safe.
And happy.
And happy. That's right. Thank you.
Well, now, would you give us an example of a young adult who was a crystal meth addict and had been homeless for 6 years before you trained?
The one that I was talking about.
Yes,
right.
And I know these people, they're beautiful
Right,
people.
right.
The father to transform this to health.
Right. And the thing that was most interesting about what this young man was living with on the streets, and if you're watching this show because Families Act or any of the other organizations that are committed to helping you with solutions, then tragically how common this is. And if you live in Santa Barbara, you see homeless kids, homeless young adults every night that you're on State Street. The thing that is so shocking to me about our beautiful Santa Barbara is the quantity of young adults who are literally living on the streets here and, in this area. So this is not uncommon. The trick is maintaining the connection. Even if there's a dual diagnosis, and I've said in addiction there always is. In my experience, in my opinion, what I've seen, it's always a dual diagnosis. So don't let that be a barrier to you. But maintaining the connection. So if this dad saw his son on State Street, he was loving, he gave him a hug, he took him to lunch. I mean, even if his son hadn't showered in, 3 days, if his son left home and was out using during that period of about 2 months when he wasn't in detox yet. He was back in town, but not in detox yet. So his dad never stopped showing how much he loved him, how much he meant to his dad, how much his dad was there for him, and that I'm committed to you, and I know you're not committed yet, and I'm committed to you. And that's what I've seen. I was working with a family in Colorado, and I was very concerned because the mother was adamant that her child would never come back home, which is, I told you, I've heard that before. But there was no place else for the child to go. And this is now a 19-year-old, so it's not a kid, it's a young adult. So there wasn't a boyfriend, there wasn't a best friend, there weren't safe places. And this became a real alarming situation for me. And they were great. They got their daughter a lot of medical care. The Amen Clinic was very, very helpful to some degree in doing a certain amount of testing. They also found a psychiatrist outside of Boulder that was very helpful in getting the right medication, using that after a psychiatrist who wasn't so helpful with a medication that wasn't, appropriate. But ultimately, the bottom line is, if you don't see this young adult regularly, if you can't check up on this young adult regularly, you don't have much impact. And so the last time I spoke to them, she's been clean for a long time, but the last time I spoke to them, she was living at home, and I was thrilled. And yes, they have to lock up their handbag and their money. They have to lock up the car keys. They do. They have to live in a very different way. But their daughter is clean. She's living at home. And after she's been clean for a little bit longer, they'll begin to get some vocational training for her so she can have a real career. Because she's a very talented artist, but she just doesn't have the actual, skills to go and get a job and keep a job yet. And that's the next step.
And I'm so grateful that love and acceptance and that staying focused on the heart connection can make such a huge difference. That's awesome.
It's obligatory. As a parent, you may want to blame them. You want to be critical. You may want to give up. You may want to scream at them. You may want to cry. All of these things are perfectly normal for any parent to want to do. Unfortunately, they don't work. Unfortunately, they're only going to send your young adult further and further away. So you can't do it. Now, I'm not saying give them all the money that you have and watch them shoot up. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you have to be very, very careful. You have to be 100% unconditionally loving at the same time that you walk the horse in the direction of the barn. Now, the horse may want to go that way, but you keep walking the horse in the direction of the barn, even if you have to go around in circles. You know you're getting to the barn, and you just keep sweetly and gently moving the horse in the direction of the barn, and eventually you get there.
Now, what was the most challenging part of this for their parents?
Yeah, there's no question that you have to be a real saint in order to have empathy all the time. And with the young man that we're talking about, who's been on my TV show, and his dad's been on a bunch of TV shows with me to talk about this, the dad is the only one in the family who has this ability. So he was out there all alone on the skinny branches. And I was the only person he knew who was offering something besides tough love. And where tough love had gotten him was his son was living on the streets in San Francisco for 6 years. So obviously it didn't work. And I've had this situation with many other parents where they tell me they were advised to take this away from their child, or this away for the young adult, or punish the young adult that way, or punish and punish, but they don't have great results. The person is not happy and functioning in life. The person is not off drugs. The person has not gone back to college. So, or if the person's in college, the person is on the verge of dropping out of college. So the results of tough love don't meet my standards. And I certainly understand why somebody is so desperate. They don't know what to do. They're just ready to rip out their hair. They're ready to call the police and have the beloved child or young adult taken away. But it doesn't help, it doesn't work. And when it's over, now theoretically you're going to have new health issues and new psychological issues, and certainly more PTSD. Because we know so many people are using drugs because of post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, either they've had some traumatic experience as children or as young adults or in school or heaven forbid, any kind of violence. And now post-traumatic stress disorder is a natural from prison or jail. You can't expect anyone to go through that without coming home with PTSD.
Thank you, Susan. Now, I'm curious, are there any parents who can't learn these skills and tools to save their children?
You can all learn it. Some of you are going to learn it faster, and some of you are going to learn it slower. Depending on how often you can speak to me in a period of time. Some people speak to me twice a week because they can. The others speak to me once a week. Those are the two choices. And how much work can you do on this? How much practice in between sessions? So I always have lots of homework available for people who want to do it because they're really desperate. And as I said, a crisis will really trigger a faster evolution. So if you're willing to really practice this, you'll get these skills much, much faster.
So encouraging. Thank you so much, Susan. I know that we're very grateful for all of your informative shows, and tonight you've walked us all through the issues that must be resolved in order for the parents to save their children who are suffering from addiction, and also how to prevent these deadly addictions. And I'd like everyone to remember that Susan is very generous in offering a 1-hour complimentary private telephone conversation just for you.
And I think we have a little bit more time. Is that right?
Oh,
I think we have a little bit more time.
Oh, yes,
So
okay.
probably the one thing that we want to talk about is how to see your young adult differently in your own mind. Because that's one thing we didn't have at a time. Now, when it was this young man who was homeless, a homeless drug addict on crystal meth, living on the streets, well, I can imagine the kind of negative adjectives that anybody could come up with, right? Of course, none of that helps. So what I said to the dad is, I have been to India many times. I've studied in India, and I also worked in India. And I said, can you see your son as one of those spiritual people wandering through India wearing orange robes that are called sadhus? A lot of them are musicians, and his son is a musician. A lot of them are smoking, ganja, a version of marijuana, and his son was on crystal meth. Can you see your son wandering through India as a sadhu, as a holy man? Now, his son received a new pair of shoes from the dad and gave them away to a friend who needed shoes. So it was not too much of a stretch. This boy is like a saint. It's like an angel. But he didn't fit into society. He didn't fit into the college-going group that had been his peers at middle school. He was different. He had learning challenges. And so everyone started to criticize him and criticize him and criticize him and criticize him. And he was doing exactly that to himself. So that's what I'm asking you to do, to consider a way to see your son or daughter that allows you to love them unconditionally, have empathy for them, and communicate with them from your heart to theirs. And that's when you enter the heart space. And that's when miracles really occur.
Oh, I love that. Beautifully said, Susan. Thank you. That's very encouraging for all of us, without issues or not. Well, now I'm going to tell everybody a little about Susan. Once again, please enjoy her Susan Allen's column as the Love and Relationship Coach in the Santa Barbara Family Life magazine. That's also available online, and that's www.sbfamilylife.com. I love reading that every month. And I'd like to announce that in March, Susan will be offering a training for parents at the Families Act organization in Santa Barbara, an organization dedicated to advocating compassionate treatment. So please contact Susan for more information. Very worthwhile. Susan's complimentary phone line is 805-695-8405, and Susan's email, susan@susanallen.org, and Susan's YouTube, youtube.com/Susan Allen 2001.
/user.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. She has the wrong information. So it's youtube.com/user/Susan Allen 2001. And just remember, it's ALLAN.
Thank you.
I have to change that.
Thank you. I will make note of that
Wonderful.
one. And now to remind all of you that we are live, the Compassionate Connection Show, every Tuesday night from 8 till 9 o'clock. And how excited and enthused we are to do this. We are going into our 9th year. Oh, it's not far away, another month. And I really appreciate hearing so many of your enjoyment of our show, the information, fabulous guests like Susan, very informative. And please share with your family, friends, and associates. We can always learn a lot from this. Moving forward, I can see half my announcements are elsewhere, so I would just like to say, something's going on there. But regardless, next week we will be focusing on nonviolent communication, the language of compassion, the language of life that Susan, of course, is very into. And also, I'd like to say thank you to our sponsor, Lucia Salons. We love Lucy. She's a doll. Also, right here at our studio, a thank you to Matt, to Mark, to JP, so many others that have contributed and been so inspiring for us. And also our director, Fred Winter. We love you, Fred. Couldn't do the show without you. And Tyler Geck, he is behind the scenes doing so much technical support. And for our viewers, please enjoy having many compassionate connections. And thank you so much for viewing. Please enjoy. Good night.
Where my spirit breathes.